Hello and welcome to my session about tenant-to-tenant migrations. I'll be covering some strategies and some best practices. My name is Peter Smith. I work as a cloud and security architect and is based out of Denmark. I'm a Microsoft MVP in M365 and is very active in the Microsoft community in Denmark, where I run the Workplace Ninja user group together with some fellow MVPs. I'll be covering the tenant migrations and when is it we see these tenant migration come into place and why. Um, Often it's business-driven migrations that comes to life, so to speak, based on mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, or maybe some rebranding. So there are different scenarios, but mostly they are driven by the business. Some of the scenarios we see out there could be a scenario like we saw a sole business unit or identity or brand that is sold off. Like in this scenario, we have a Contoso brand. So another company has bought them, and as part of the migration, they want to keep the Contoso branding and the identity around that as well. That's one scenario in terms of migrations that we see a lot. And when trying to do a migration without a rebranding, it's called a single event migration because the domain, contoso.com, can actually only live in one tenant. So we'll have to, as part of the migration of the users and the data we have, we also have to transfer over that domain. And as part of this, we need to plan for this, and we need to plan for it to happen in sort of a cutover process in a single event. And thereby we also need to take into consideration in the planning that we need to move all the users in such a scenario. Again, because the domain can only live or exist in one tenant at a time. Other scenarios would be that we see a business unit being sold off, but as part of the merger or that it has been acquired, would be that they are moving into the branding of the target company. So even though the source tenant or the sole company would be using, like in this example, a Fabricam, they might be moving over to the target tenant that are using Contoso. Thereby, we don't need to plan for domains being moved over or transitioned, at least not at the same time or a specific cutover date as we have to in a single event of migration. So in those scenarios, we can do it in a more staged and phased fashion, and thereby gradually move users, services, and data and so on to the other tenant. There are some different advantages and disadvantages of the different scenarios here. If we take a step back and look into the single event migration, some of the advantages here is that it's less complex because we can do any the whole migration in one step, so to speak. So our transition window will be quite minimal, and thereby we have a shorter time frame in which we work with the migration of data, the transition of users, and also education of the users that they are moving over into a new tenant and new systems and so on. That is often easier to tell the end users because all users is being moved at the same time. But it can also have some risks because we're moving everything at the same time. So We have a lot up in the air at the same time because of this. Um, so it requires a lot of planning and also a lot of testing. And it also makes it very complex, especially in large data migrations, or if we have a lot of users that we need to take into the consideration and the planning in this single event. So depending on the scale of the environments that we work with, it could require a lot more resources doing the actual migrations here. If we take the other approach with the phased migrations, it seems less risky and lots easier to execute because we can split up the users that we move over into, it could be departments or smaller batches, and thereby making it easier for support both of the users, but also doing the maintenance of the migration and the migration of data, so to speak. And especially if we have really, really large environments with a lot of users and also a lot of data, it's sometimes impossible to move that amount of data and that amount of users in one single phase. So thereby we often see that a phased migration is basically the only option we have. Um, some of the disadvantages here is that because it goes on for a longer time, we could have some requirements between coexistence between the old environment and new environment, and thereby making our migration and the environments a lot more complex that we need to manage during the whole migration process. So it will also require a lot of planning and sometimes because of the complexity, difficult processes behind it as well. The major disadvantage here is that it will eventually become more time consuming because you're sort of stretching the whole migration over a longer period of time, and thereby consuming resources and for a longer time, and the users that we're moving, well, they are working together with their colleagues, but maybe half the colleagues has been migrated, and the rest of the colleagues will eventually be migrated over the next couple of weeks or so. So thereby, it will be a lot more time consuming, and complex in terms of the coexistency that is required as well. No matter how we look into a tenant migration, in terms of the different scenarios we have, um, the, we have different steps that is important and can be reflected into most scenarios. And one of the first ones is the discovery phase, where we need to do a proper assessment of the shared environment, and we need that to get our planning in place so we can scope the project and the timeline in the best manner here. Um, and also based on this, it gives us the overview of, based on that scoping, what we are migrating and which tools will be the best to handle the different workloads that we want to migrate. And that can really depend on the amount of data and the complexity of the environments that we have, what tools would be the best for this type of migrations. Next off, it's also important that we do a proper testing. So when we have the tools in place and have configured and designed that for the whole migration, we need to take time into the plan here for proper testing, because it's not just moving data from one tenant to another. It's the whole environment with how the end users see the migration phase, and especially after the migration, how will the end users, when they start their laptops, experience uh, that they have been moved over into a different tenant. All that needs to be properly tested. And based on the testing, you also get a lot of valuable information that you can use for communicating to the end users properly. Next phase we'll go into is the migration phase, and that also can be sort of split up because depending on how much data we have, we could have a pre-stage phase where we need to pre-stage a lot of the data before we have that cutover migration window. After the migration, you should set up time for proper hypercare because the support and the hypercare of the end users is also very important for a transition and a migration project to succeed, because eventually it will be the experience of the end users that will measure the success of projects like this. And also plan for some post-migration task because you will need to set up time so you can properly clean out the old environment that will not be needed anymore. You need to make sure they're not users, you still have data, there's no more licenses and so on within those old tenants that we have been migrated from. In terms of the assessment tools, there's a great community tool out there based from a fellow MVP who made this, and it's available on Practical 365. There are also third-party tools that can do a proper job, and we also have some reporting tools within M365 that does a decent job. Or we need the as much information as possible about what we have within the workloads. How many mailboxes, the amount of data in the mailbox is the same for SharePoint. How many sites, how large are the sites we have in there, and the amount of data and so on. We need the full overview of all the workloads to take that into a decent planning. So that discovery and assessment phase is very important here because we really need to know the users and the data we have to do the proper planning. Next off here would be moving into the data. We need to have a good overview of what about the identity, because the identity is the key for our end users. Are we migrating the users? There are tools out there, and depending on if you're moving from AD to AD or you're moving from enter to enter, or from an AD to enter, and depending on the tools that are being used, is it a migration or do we basically create new users into the new tenant? That part is very important in terms of also mapping it up within tools that is being used. Next up would then be the actual data we have out there. So we need to identify the workloads where we are migrating from. So with the Microsoft Intro, we have the identities, the users that is in place in the migration, but we also have other important workloads where we typically see data that is being migrated from. We have the Exchange Online where we have the user mailboxes, we have shared mailboxes, we could have resources, distribution groups, and so on. All that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of that proper assessment and the planning. So often doing the assessment, you get the overview, but all that needs to be identified and agreed with the business what actually needs to be moved here during the migration. The same goes for what we see in OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams, and eventually Planner. That's typically the most major workloads where we see data migrations being done between tenant to tenant. But of course, we have a lot of other places within M365 where we have data and so on. So what about those? We have an Intune, we have policies, devices, and so on. Um, we don't have a tool that can specifically migrate Intune content like that, but there are community tools and tools available out there that can actually export a lot of this information and move that back into Intune in another tenant. So if you have requirements about moving some of those things from Intune, you'll have to look into using some of those tools available out there. Along with the stream. So if we still using stream or have videos available in stream, there are no tools that can actually migrate that from one tenant to another. So that's more like the users need to identify which videos they want to have moved over into the new tenant, and they'll have to download that and then again upload it in the target tenant. Same goes for the Microsoft Forms. It's also more like a user task doing the migration because we don't have a tool that can actually migrate the forms. Um, but users can actually identify which forms they have been used, and they can then make the template available. So when they log into the new tenant, they can sort of save that template they made of the form, and thereby actually move the form over. And the same goes for the data they have. They need to save it down in Excel or CSV file and move the data. And of course, we can have data in Viva Engage, Azure, information protection, and so on. All that needs to be taken care of properly in the manner that is available. It really depends on where we have data, and of course, Azure is a big one. It's typically a project in itself, depending on if you're using SaaS services or if you have servers located in Azure and so on. And then we have the whole Power Platform, Dynamics platform, and so on. Um, and that needs to be taken care of by specialists within those areas. I know Microsoft has delivered tools for like the Power Platform in terms of tenant-to-tenant migration, and also for some of the dynamics, if that's being used, often it's in cooperation with or collaboration with Microsoft support or Dynamics partners, where they can actually move a lot of this behind the scenes. So all that needs to be taken into consideration as well as part of an overall migration. And while talking about migration, what about if a company still have systems on-prem? Um, what do we do about those? Of course, you need to take it into the planning and create separate tracks in a migration process, project that takes care of these different systems that you still have on-prem. Would you still need them? Do you want to move them still to a new on-prem environment at the target, or how do you really want to take care of this? So when we dive into the specific migration, we see different challenges. One of them is the encrypted data using sensitivity labels. So if an organization has been using sensitivity labels to encrypt data, you need to be aware of where that is being used, because depending on the tools that you're using, you will have to create processes around how we move that data. Because eventually, if you just move it one to one, you'll not be able to open that data in the target tenant because they've been encrypted with uh, user information from the source, and so thereby they cannot be opened without authenticating against the source tenant. But there are tools out there that can actually migrate data that has these different labels, and thereby relabeling them during the migration process. But you need to identify that as part of the whole assessment as well. Same goes for the use of DLPs and retention policies. If that is heavily being used, you need to identify them and basically recreate them in the new target. You also need to be aware of the audit logs. It's not data that you can basically just export and import back into a new tenant. So if you have requirements to keeping those audit logs or anything like that for a longer time, you need to be aware of if it's information that has value to you before you close down the old source tenant. In terms of exchange and email, sometimes we see complex mail flows. You need to be aware of that specialized mail flow, or do we have specialized partner connections and so on? If so, do they need to be recreated? Do we have connectors that encrypt specifically to certain partners and so on? And if so, and if we still have those requirements, do we need to recreate those at the target tenant? So you need to identify that way beyond just the users and the data that we have in the different workloads. You also need to be aware of meetings. So when we are migrating a user calendar, the meetings is being migrated. But basically, if we have meetings, those meetings is created by a user in the source tenant. So if we want to update those meetings in the target tenant as a user, um, you cannot update and send out an updated invite or maybe a cancellation to people because that meeting is actually still owned uh, by the person in the source tenant. So you'll have to delete that and create a new meeting. Some tools out there will actually be able to pick up the meeting and automatically doing the migration, cancel it in the source tenant and recreate the meeting doing the migration in the target tenant so the users don't really experience anything besides the people who's being invited to a lot of these meetings, or of course get new invites to the meetings. You also need to be aware of the external guests. So all the guests that has been invited into SharePoint site, the team sites and so on, they typically need to be re-invited back in because we cannot migrate the users, so to speak, from one tenant to another. When we do the data migration, you need to be aware of the performance, and that's also why it's very important to do some testing around this, depending on the amount of data that you have. We have bandwidth throttling in the M365, so moving a lot of data in SharePoint will often get hit by throttling, and therefore it's also important that you take that into consideration, do proper planning around moving a lot of data because you can get hit by the throttling. So if you have a huge amount of data that you expect to be moving over a weekend, well, maybe you cannot move it because of the throttling, and thereby it's easier for us to plan for it and do some pre-staging to move a lot of these data beforehand, and then you basically just need to catch up and do the deltas doing the cutover process. For Exchange, it's a little bit different because we can increase the bandwidth throttling and thereby get a lot of better throughput. So we typically don't see any issues on the Exchange side moving data in large amounts. So we also see app registration or access to other cloud apps based on intra access and so on. If there are requirements that users need access to those applications and so on after migration, you need to be aware of that and then recreate those app registrations or access to third-party apps and so on as part of the whole migration process. And it's more like a manual process, but it's still something you need to be aware of that can be a challenging part here. Um, Licensing and subscriptions. Basically, you need to be aware of if we have any licensing still in the old environment, and especially be aware of if you have 12-month commitments on some of the SKUs, or depending on the mix of SKUs and subscriptions. Um, you need to be aware of that, especially for that source environment, so you don't get stuck doing the migration with an automatic renew of the next 12 months or something like that. So as soon as you know anything about a migration, you need to dive into when are the renewal on the different licenses, are they around the same time that we do cutovers and so. So be aware of it and plan for it doing a migration. So for the actual migration, we have different tools out there. Microsoft has some tools available, cross-tenant mailbox migration, cross-tenant OneDrive migration, which is tools that can be purchased on a SKU through CSP and so on, for handling data in Exchange mailboxes and in the user OneDrives. We also have similar tools available in preview for SharePoint, and then for identity mapping, and a newer tool that came maybe 6 months ago or so, on the Power Platform, where we on the Power Platform side can actually move a lot of the data, or data versus, as well. Besides Microsoft, there's a lot of third-party tools out there that does similar things. Um, Most of the benefits with the third parties is that they tend to do a lot of workloads in the same tool. Um, some tools might be specialized within SharePoint Teams, whatever, some from the Exchange side, but most of the tools actually are able to handle um, migrations of all our workloads, basically, or at least the important workloads. But again, a lot of the tools have limitations, so you need to, when deciding on this, dive into the documentation of each of the tools so you get to know the differences, know what the limitations are. So based on that, we can decide on or know what can we migrate and what can we not migrate as part of this process. Because again, what can we not migrate is an important step that we need to communicate back to the business if we see something that is potentially a problem. And again, for the end users and the business, it's very important that we, through the whole process of the tenant migration, communicate properly to the end users what is going to happen here. And especially the closer we get to the migration part, when will they be migrated? How will that affect them? Are there tasks being run before and maybe after? Are there certain tasks they will need to do themselves, depending on how the deployment is, of different software, mobile phones, and so on? You need to communicate that to the end users, and it really is different from business to business on how to approach this, both in terms of how we communicate with them, the frequency, and so on. But a responsibility has to be placed doing a project like this, that certain people are in charge of that communication, and also together with the help desk and the support, so everyone agree on how we target and communicate best to the end users here, because eventually it's the end users that are being moved to a different tenant. They expect all the old data to be there. They expect they can work more or less as they used to. But some things has changed, some things needs to be updated, and some things will be different after a migration. So it's important we communicate that properly. And in my experience, we can change a lot of things as long as we communicate that properly. It's typically fine for the end users, but if they don't have any information, a project like this from their side will will be really bad. Um, so remember that it's a journey doing a migration like this, and it's important that we have stakeholders in the entire organization to make sure this is a success. And it's very important that we spend proper time on the assessment, the planning, and the testing, because that is the key in doing the being ready for the actual migration and also for the end user adoption here. So planning and end user communication is really the key here. Some warning signs you need to be aware of if there's not a proper sponsor within the organization that can really stand guard for what is going on and what is required from a project like this. It's a warning. Again, it's a warning if you don't get the proper assessment or you don't have the proper access to the environments on both sides, because it can be very hard to actually migrate data if you don't get that full access, full overview, and so on. It's also very important to involve people who has been working with migrations, because planning these migrations, setting a strategy on how do we do these things and when, it's very important to do, because otherwise you will end up with an unrealistic timeline or expectations on how that project can be done, and then it will not be a proper success. So the summary here is, make sure you have a good assessment here, because that assessment is going to be scoping the plan that eventually will be the plan to success for the end users, along with the end user adoption and a proper communication to those end users. Make sure you do the proper testing around this. Not only test data migrations in the different workloads, because that is just one track here in the migration. Also make sure you test together with the end users that how do they experience logging into laptops and so on after migration, accessing application, accessing data, and all that. All that needs to be tested properly, and also allow time to do a pre-sync of the data. If you have a large amount of data, it's important to do that pre-stage of the data, and make sure you have a proper project organization to back this, because most of these migrations is different, and most of them is complex. So it's very important you have a good team of people that can back this, and also that you have people internally or externally from Microsoft, or as a Microsoft partner that has experience with migrations, that can help guide along the way in migration scenarios like this. But that's my take on some strategies and key best practices in terms of tenant-to-tenant migrations. So, and thank you for this time and this year of the festive tech calendar. So have a Merry Christmas.